Hello, I'm Noel Cheer. My guest tonight advocates both rational passion and passionate reason. It's a mistake, he says, to see reason and passion in opposition. The resolution of this apparent paradox is embodied in what we might call his creed, objectivism. This was articulated for him by the mid-20th century American writer Ayn Rand, whom he called an epoch-making giant. To bring all those threads together, I'm pleased to welcome to Triangle Television the New Zealand founder of libertarianism, Lindsay Perigo. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Triangle Television. Why was Ayn Rand so important that we should take notice of her?
I think you'd better take notice of her because the whole world is at the moment. I see you've got a
The book,
copy
yeah,
of
we'll wave that in a moment.
Atlas Shrugged sitting there.
Yeah.
You know that's hitting the bestseller lists again all these years after
it's what, 50
Ayn
years
Rand's
old,
death
yeah.
and all these years after publication.
Yes.
It came out in 1958, so that's 51 years on.
Yes.
And the reason for that has to be word of mouth and the fact that people are somehow aware that this book is the solution and the explanation for the current crisis that we're in.
So how we got here and what we got to do about it, it's all in there.
It's there, but it's fiction.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's fiction,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's non-fiction
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the sense that it's prophetic. If you
Yeah.
dip into those
Yeah.
pages, and I'm
Okay.
sure you have,
It's a bit-
you'll think, my God,
Yeah.
how did she know?
It's very long. Yeah, but the book has been both celebrated and deplored,
Oh,
so
yes.
it's a very polarising book.
Yes, nothing wrong with that.
No.
I think obviously anyone who comes with a clear message is going to be polarising. I know it's very fashionable nowadays not to have a clear message at all.
Yeah.
The idea is not to cause offence to
Yeah,
anyone.
yeah.
So you fudge everything. Weasel words, as I call it.
Yes.
The world is perishing from an orgy of weasel words.
Well, okay.
You never got weasel words from Ayn Rand. You knew exactly where she stood.
Yeah.
And she alienated conservatives
Yeah.
and liberals because of her atheism. The liberals didn't mind that so much, but the conservatives certainly did. She said the traditional conservative defence of capitalism just doesn't stack up. In fact, it concedes the opponent's ground to the opponents.
Yeah.
And she gave it a different secular underpinning. And that's why, to come to your question, why is she so important? If capitalism is to have a future, then we must discover and apply that underpinning.
It's a sort of purification.
Based on secular reason, not on a non-existent God.
Well, because there's a lot of other people beating the atheist drum these days, Dawkins and Hitchens and so on.
I
So
know.
there's a lot of, it's much more fashionable nowadays than it used to be.
Sort of, but you see, it's an atheism in their case that doesn't go anywhere. I mean, imagine writing a whole book about why there is no God. What a waste of time. Because the onus of proof, Dawkins,
But she's saying,
clever that he is, doesn't realise
Yeah.
this. You don't have to write a whole book
Yeah.
saying the probability of God is 5% or minus 5 or
Yeah.
whatever he comes up with.
Yeah.
The onus of proof is on he who says there is a God. Okay, fine, prove it.
Yeah.
But until that time, I won't believe in it.
We'll try and bring the God thing back in a moment, because as I see, the theme of the book is that the people who carry the world ought to go on strike. Is that why Atlas Shrugged? Is that what that's pointing to?
If they're being exploited, they should go on strike. That's what they do in Atlas Shrugged. They are the ones on whom everything is blamed.
She talks about looters and smoochers.
Smoochers are the people, the parasites who do nothing, but expect to be delivered everything at the expense of those who do the producing.
Are these smoochers, are these any social welfare
Moochers.
recipients? Oh, sorry.
Moochers and looters.
Oh, okay. Well, I got my yes on the wrong.
Well, smoochers is close
Well,
enough.
whatever. Okay.
But
The moochers.
has a slightly different connotation, which I don't think she intended.
No, not in this case. No. But so the moochers are the people who are parasitic on the productive and creative people. So would you put all social welfare recipients, all pension recipients in that category?
Oh, well, no, certainly not pension recipients, because they're simply claiming back what they've been putting in over a lifetime. I would prefer the government didn't do it. In fact, Ayn Rand would forbid the government from doing it, because she said the government really is restricted to law courts and defence and the upholding of contracts, law and order and defence. So things like charity, welfare, etc., are all in the voluntary part of life, which of course is the whole point of the exercise and the whole reason you have government. Every human interaction, adult at least, should be voluntary. And it's to protect the right to voluntary interaction, which means autonomy over your own life. That is why we have government, not to dish out money here and there to anyone who
So the
demands it.
looters are the governments who take tax. All taxation is theft. Someone else said that. But is that the general trend?
Compulsory taxation is theft. I should say, I mean, you'll then say to me, well, how do you finance government? And, oh, that's ridiculous if you're going to say that it can be funded out of voluntary taxation because no one will pay it. Ayn Rand was always at pains to say, look, that's the very last reform that we implement when the whole culture has changed, so that people don't see government as the enemy, don't see the taxman as the enemy, but realise why they need a government and that will then contribute to it as they take out insurance.
So her central theme was objectivism. What's that in a couple of sentences?
Well, take your cue from the word objectivism. It aims for objectivity, and what it says basically is that man's distinctive faculty, not his only faculty, but his distinctive faculty is reason. And the job of reason is to identify reality and draw conclusions about it so that man can live. Life is the standard of value. Reason is man's tool of survival. And so obviously the process of ascertaining, identifying reality must be objective if you're going to get it right. But if it's not objective, you'll get it wrong.
But you'd see one of the counters to rationality would be religion in the terms you've described. But there must be other counters. There must be other... I'm saying the blind consumerism that we're all wrapped up in nowadays, that is a quasi-religion, isn't it? And that's really not really very clever at all.
Well, it may not be, but you see, you're at liberty to argue against it and not participate in it. So if you don't like consumerism, if you don't like consumer goods, get off the chair you're sitting on and sit on the floor. Lie on a bed of nails.
Right.
But who's going to make that for you? I mean, consumerism is good. And this sort of stuff about blind consumerism, it's part of the left wing's campaign against capitalism. You're sounding like Barack Obama.
Well, I've got to have a count.
With all due respect, you're not nearly as bad. I know you've got questions about it.
No, we're going to do a little segue here because people will recognise you as a broadcaster from way back. You had a career in broadcasting. You were in radio in the 70s, you were in TV from the mid-80s to early 90s, but then you left TV and you flung back to them the challenge that television was brain dead. And I think a lot of people applauded.
Oh, yes. It went on for weeks. I had no idea it would cause such a furore. I thought it would be a quiet little piece on Barry Shaw's television page in the New Zealand Herald. When I opened the paper the next morning, it was front page headlines, cartoons, the works. So obviously it struck a chord.
So what was your grounds for then saying that it was brain dead?
What I could see was happening was a person who shall remain nameless, one of the TVNZ executives, had announced to anyone who cared to listen that the day of the studio interview was over. The studio interview was dead.
Here we are.
Excuse us.
Here we are.
Well, we're both corpses, of course. And they were downplaying and relegating to late times at night, late time slots, those programs in which there were head-to-head studio interviews.
What was he putting in preference to?
Well, nothing. Just film items and razzmatazz,
dancing,
you know, all that. Well, we didn't have that. And mind you, I love that program. So, you know, there's a place for all of that. But what I was talking about specifically was news and current affairs.
Yes.
And when your boss is saying that the day of the studio interview is over, then you realise when you're a studio interviewer, and that's your main claim to fame, this place is not long for you, and you are not long for this place. That was about a year before I flounced, I suppose. So I went through a lot of soul searching because, you know, it was an awfully attractive job to have and well paying.
But the day of the long interview, we're doing a 27-minute interview.
Oh, that still hasn't come back.
Hasn't come back.
No.
And there seems, our own feeling, our own experiences, there is a place for it. It may not be a mainstream television top of the pops thing, but there is a constituency out there for it.
I'm sure there is, and I'm sure it's big enough, more than big enough, to be mainstream. It may appeal mainly to old farts like us, but there are a lot of us. Let's say we're talking the 45 to 105 age group, and they've got enough money spread out among them to be an audience worth cultivating. But the emphasis, for whatever reason, is solely on gum-chewing teenagers.
So you would still own that statement that the mainstream television, at least, is brain dead?
News and current affairs.
Current affairs,
yes.
yes.
Yeah.
What
There's a
about-
lot of television I love.
Yes.
I'm quite a TV addict,
Yes.
now that we have so much choice.
Yes.
But news and current affairs, you know, I get mine mainly from Fox, which you'll be horrified at.
I understand that.
But they have some terrific interviews. But again, I don't like all the banging and clanging that goes on. Why can't they just calm down?
Yeah.
What are they afraid will happen if they just talk normally? But when the alternative is CNN, which has a marked left-wing bias, I go with Fox, and it really does keep you up to date, and it's stimulating.
Maybe you've cottoned on to something here. Well, you've helped me cotton on to something that we're now no longer talking about broadcasting on television. We're talking about narrowcasting. We're talking about sectional interests of people. And people who want your kind of program, they go to Fox. Other people will go to Al Jazeera. Other people will go to BBC. Other people will come to Triangle Television. People will select. You can now pick up television on your computer, for instance.
Well, you know, it's one of the great joys of free enterprise.
Yeah.
And, you know, that blind consumerism you were
Yeah.
talking about.
But we don't have
and
to-
I'm sure you wouldn't want to dispense with that.
No, we don't have to march to the drum of some central broadcasting authority that says what will be on the television.
No, and that's great.
You've been, up until recently, the editor of The Free Radical. What does The Free Radical stand for?
Everything we've just been talking about. The right of each person to live his life as he chooses, without he, of course, in the old-fashioned sense. You know,
yes,
before we got
the
politically
the
correct,
pre-political
where it
correct.
covers
Yeah, okay.
men and women.
Okay.
Don't you hate that thing where they use a plural pronoun and a singular verb, or vice versa? Horrible. But yes, I started that in 1994 when I was living in Wanganui, actually, at the time. And I kept that up for about 12 years. Peter Cresswell is the editor now. And he's doing a sterling job. It's still there. But that's what it was. It was an advocate of, or there for the advocacy of individual liberty.
And an individual in the face of predatory governments, basically.
Yes, it's really only governments. Governments have a legal monopoly on the use of force. So, I mean, obviously murderers and rapists, etc., are a threat to your freedom, but that's what government's there for, to stop those
There seems to
people.
be, if I might use the term, an elitist thread, almost a thread like Plato's Republic. That there is there's a stratification of. Well, no, you've lined up Ayn Rand with Aristotle, but it seems to be also the Platonic notion of a stratified society in which there are people who are destined to rule and there are people who are destined to be at the bottom.
No, the very opposite.
Right.
What do you mean by rule?
Around the country.
No, we elect them.
Yeah.
So it's not a question of destiny. Yeah. We elect them as we do now, but we severely limit the scope of what they can do.
Yes.
They are there to serve us, not to rule us, not to dictate how we live our lives, but to protect our rights.
They should manage the
to
place.
Do that.
Yeah.
And as far as everything else is concerned, well, that's over to the marketplace, and you will rise as high as your ability takes you. And if you're not particularly ambitious and you're content with less, well, you're allowed to have less. There's no sort of enforced redistribution so that we all get the same amount of pay, as in Fidel Castro's Cuba, when a brain surgeon gets the same pay, or did until recently. I think that's one of the recent reforms, as a rubbish collector.
You have spoken out very strongly against Barack Obama. Now, of all the American presidents, since perhaps John Kennedy, he's the one who's received the most adulation. Maybe partly as a relief of he's no longer George Bush, but you come out very recently and called him the anti-American president, and you think that he's undermining every good thing that America stands for.
He is. Yeah. He is the anti-American president, which is a play on the movie of the title, The American President. He's the anti-American president. He, at a fundamental level, and this is why I single him out. You know, there are lots of things you can criticize other presidents for, but at a fundamental level, he is against what America was founded on, the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. He is for government taking all that over. And we've seen in the fewer than 100 days still, when I wrote what you just quoted, government expands in a way that probably, if you took all the other presidents combined, he's outdone them in that short time. And somebody, I forget who, said of him just recently, if America's enemies want to destroy America, they'd better get on with it before Barack Obama does it for them.
Okay, but he might plead a special case. He's got a real big problem on his plate that hasn't happened really since the 30s.
Oh, well, he does indeed. But you see, all the more reason to ask him, plead with him, but it shouldn't be necessary to do that, to go back to America's founding principles. Yes. You don't solve a problem that was caused by government intervention in the first place, which it was, if you go right back to the subprime loans and why they were occurring. You don't fix that and the things that result from it with more of the same.
But was it, with the subprime loans debacle, it wasn't so much that the government interfered as the government took the hands off the steering wheel. They deregulated.
No. But the government pressured the banks to give out these loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them. The Community Reinvestment Act, which was Jimmy Carter, and then strengthened by Clinton, and then later re-invoked by Bush, so it doesn't really matter whether it's Democrat or Republican. They all have this itch to expand the power of government, so and they have government do so-called good things.
So you're not criticising Obama for causing the current problem, but that he's not
obviously he didn't cause the current problem.
In fact, it was the very right-wing governments, if you like. It was the George Bush on whose watch it broke out.
On whose watch, but you know, they were aware of the looming problem 2 years or so before, and you know, one of the people who actually sounded the alarm bells was John McCain, and I was astonished at why he didn't make more of that during the election campaign. I thought his campaign, I was in America at the time, was about the most pitiful I've seen, and you know, you could tell a mile off that Barack was going to win because he had such
McCain didn't have his heart
quality. I'd love for Barack Obama to be on my side because with the attributes that he has. But he's just, everything he's done, with the exception of capturing the pirates, has horrified me.
Wasn't Sarah Palin the 2IC to John McCain? Wasn't she one of the darlings of Fox News?
Yes.
But she turned out to be disastrous for McCain.
Right. I think McCain was disastrous for McCain, frankly. I think in the end, Sarah Palin turned out to be irrelevant. Nobody could save McCain from himself. And I think at the time he made that selection, everyone realised he was going to have to pull a rabbit out of the hat. And I guess some would say he pulled a bunny out of the hat.
Indeed.
But you know, I think she got a bum rap from the media, and they focused on every little flub that she made. And of course she made a lot. But I gather she's working on a comeback for 3 or 4 years' time, and we'll see what happens.
But what Obama seems to be doing, apart from the special things he feels he's got to do to address the current problem, he promotes a mixed economy rather than the pure 19th century pure capitalism. There's a nostalgia, isn't there, for going back to the 19th century where every man who could carve out a fortune could and no one could get in their way. Isn't that passé?
Well, I don't care if it's passé. It's still good.
What about the folks at the bottom? Why are they there?
Well, the bottom gets raised. The more productivity there is, the more wealth there is, as Obama would have it, to spread around, the better the bottom do. I mean, we just say, and that's good, just put the gun away. Don't actually hold out a gun and hold it to the heads of people who've made money and say, oh, I'm going to take some of that from you and give it to these people over here. Because all you do is encourage these people over here to do nothing because they realise they don't have to do anything. And they breed, and they breed more people with that mentality, and bingo, you've got a problem on your hands.
So that almost sounds as though they kind of like being there, and all they need is the funding to stay where they are. Don't people, given the appropriate incentives, want to raise their own lifestyles?
Yes. Well, exactly. You proved my point.
Yeah. But you're saying giving them what you might call welfare handouts is a disincentive to improving themselves.
Yes.
They're not just help to get them where they want to go, like help with housing and help with.
Well, that's fine. If you want to help, what we say is go ahead and help. No one's stopping you. But understand, it's the compulsion, it's the coercion, and that has to be banished for human existence to be called civilized. Force must be banished. And it doesn't matter how noble you think what you are using force for is. Force bad.
Because we have something of an echo here of Roosevelt's New Deal, what Obama's doing, and Ayn Rand really disagreed with Roosevelt's New Deal.
Yes.
Yeah, she put it down to collectivism, altruism, and statism. These were all negative.
That's right.
Even though his intention was a good one, was to put the country back on its feet.
Yeah.
And so the intention wasn't good enough. Did he not deliver the appropriate things?
Well, no, he didn't actually. If you study the period, contrary to what most people come out of school thinking, he made it worse. At best, he delayed the recovery. At worst, he made it worse and prolonged it. And what saved him in the end was World War II. But again, to answer your question, the moral issue is, yes, she objected to it, A, because it's economically nonsensical, but B, it's immoral. And she was primarily a moralist, and she objected primarily on moral grounds. And that is why she said that she came to the conclusion, after all these experiences, that capitalism needs a much better defence than this. And she looked around and thought, obviously, no one else is going to give it one, I'd better do it myself. Okay. So, and that is how Galt's speech at the Shrug came.
There's a long essay-like speech in there called Galt's speech. So if you want the nub of the book, go for that. New Zealand is a capitalist country, surely?
Semi.
Nah.
We're one of those mixed economies that you talked about.
What does New Zealand need to do in order to make a better New Zealand?
Become capitalist.
Be more honestly capitalist. So what specifics would you do? If you've suddenly got the show to run, it's all yours.
Oh, yeah.
Oh boy.
Is this a threat or a promise?
It's the baubles of power.
The main thing to do, of course, you've got to realise you can't just do that. You can't just wave a wand and make everything happen overnight. But you've got to lower the tax burden, and you've got to lower the regulatory burden. In other areas, just remove so-called crimes off the statute books that have no victims, so that you relieve the pressure on the police force. So that means decriminalising not just marijuana, but all drugs, so that the cops aren't spending their time running around looking for P-labs and that sort of thing. So you remove victimless crimes, and that's something you can do quite quickly.
It might be debatable that a P-lab is victimless. Just surely the people doing it. And
yeah, but no one forces them to take it.
No.
Now, the other side of that, of course, is you must have very tough law and order provisions in place, so that people know if they commit a crime, whether it's under the influence of a drug or not, the law will come down on them like a ton of bricks.
So you might, on the one hand, approve of seatbelts, but you wouldn't approve of the enforcement.
Compulsory seatbelts. Do you mind if I pinch your
Go
water?
ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Compulsory seatbelts, unless, of course, you've got to realise that in a free enterprise society, the roads will be privately owned, and if the owners said you can't come on these roads without a seatbelt, well then fine, that's over to them, and that's still part of this voluntary interaction thing that we're talking about. It's when government, we're safety obsessed. And I'm interested in all these child experts coming out and saying kids aren't allowed to do anything. You can't climb a jungle gym without getting a resource consent to put it up and then some kind of consent to climb the damn
So this is
thing.
the nanny state that people
you're
talking about. Now, in John Galt's huge speech in Atlas Shrugged there, he said that he would make a pledge that he would never live his life for the sake of another man, nor ask any other man to live for him. So altruism's out.
Altruism in the sense that you're here, your primary duty in life is to sacrifice for another. Altruism, the way objectivists use the term, and the way it was used by Auguste Comte, who coined the term, doesn't just mean benevolence, which is what most people think it does mean. It means self-sacrifice on principle, that you live for others. That's the literal meaning of it, otherism. So yes, that's out. But it doesn't mean that you don't interact or do things for each other, but it's by mutual agreement
and it's a reciprocal, what, informed self-interest, rational self-interest.
Yes.
Because many religious organisations would talk about either sacrificing or doing service to others without expectation of return. But I think you don't have that. You wouldn't give something without some expectation of return.
Well, I might, if the thing is a big enough value. For instance, I'm a great lover of operatic voices. If I knew someone, a young student who had the greatest voice I ever heard, but lacked the wherewithal to pay for lessons, then I might well provide, if I had the wherewithal to do it, give that person the money, not just lend, because there is actually a return in the development of the voice. It's a value. Well, if you read Atlas Shrugged, you realise the extent to which Ayn Rand talks about values, 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 values. Life is about values, the pursuit and acquisition of values.
Quite a lot of the language, I thought, both in what you've written and what I read from Atlas Shrugged, there is quasi-religious. It's talking about, you know, the meaning of life and the beauty of life and so on. It's it's like religion in many ways.
Well, but there's no mystical element.
No. There's no. Well, like Marxism was a kind of secular
Marxism
religion.
was a secular religion.
Yeah.
I don't think you can say that about objectivism, because the one thing it tells you to do is repair to your reason. It doesn't give you canned answers to every situation. Like, you know, the questions you're asking me about what do you do if you're in government, you'll get as many different answers as there are objectivists, because none of us has worked out a program as to how we'd actually get there if we were in a position to implement.
But you're basically
we advocate the general principles and get us moving in that direction.
So wind back government.
Wind back.
Get them out of our lives.
Yes.
And have a lot more freedom and get rid of the prosecution of victimless crimes.
Yes. And in your own life, make sure you're enjoying it. Ayn Rand said at one point that contrary to the religious idea of morality, the idea of morality is not to suffer and die, but to enjoy yourself and live. And of course that's one of the reasons she was detested by everybody. Morality necessarily, in the traditional view, whether it's secular or mystical, is something that involves mortification and suffering and self-denial. But the objectivists won't have a bar of that. It's not hedonism. It's not sort of mindless self-indulgence, because the mind is everything. Well, I was going to say the mind is everything, but the mind is fundamental in objectivism.
One final question, because we're out of time. Was this example of television brain dead?
No, and I thank you very much for it.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. We've got to end the programme now. Grateful thanks to Lindsay Perigo and to you, our audience. Thank you for spending some of your time with us. Here's a thought to take away with you, and it came from Lindsay's website. He said, "We seek nothing less than to change the world." Until our next conversation, I'm Noel Cheer. Good night.